Hello and welcome to the Avrum Rosensweig Show.
Welcome to one of the internet's best podcasts, where we dive deep into the lives of the extraordinary and fascinating people who leave an indelible mark on our world. Join us as we explore their captivating stories, remarkable achievements, and unique perspectives that shape history and inspire generations. Get ready to embark on a journey through the lives of inspiring people unlike any other.
Hello and welcome to the show. My name is Avrum Rosensweig and I'm delighted to be here with you. I want to thank all of my listeners and viewers for being here with me again. I'm very, very grateful for that. And I remind you that what we're trying to accomplish here is to give humankind a great big hug. The show's idea really is that while we live in difficult times, and some more difficult times for others, for some than others, that the truth of the matter is we have to keep our eye on the ball, which is that the world and the earth that we share is a beautiful place. It really is. There's magnificence in our world. I've been spending a lot of time in the hospital with a dear, dear friend of mine who's dying. And when you go to the hospital and you sit in the room with someone whom you love dearly, a friend, family member, and we should never have those experiences, you're privy to the kindness that happens within a hospital environment. We often talk about the hospitals being a place which doesn't smell good, or the walls are colored in these awful greens and yellows. But what we often fail to mention is the nurses, who we meet for a very short time, but we are able to see them as they do their work. And that's been my experience for the last few days with my dear friend Marty. And I have really, really been privy to a deep, deep sense of caring and empathy and sympathy for what he's going through. And he's dying, unfortunately. But the care that he is given, not only in the one hospital that he's in right now, but in other hospitals that he's been in, it's just magnificent. I was on the phone with him this morning, and I heard a nurse giving him a blood test. Marty likes to sort of metaphorically hold hands on the phone. It's important to him because he's scared. And I heard the nurse apologizing to him profusely for the pain that she was causing him. And I thought, how many of us go to work and we have to apologize to somebody for pain that we're causing them? Most of us not. But that's her day-to-day job. And she's going to go in on Monday. She's going to go in on Tuesday. And she's going to do the same thing on Wednesday. And she's going to be empathetic towards the individual whom she is trying to get better. I think we have to keep our eye on such people, and we have to be conscious of the beauty that exists in our world through kindness and giving and love. Now, in that light, I am very, very excited and very, very honored to have with me as my guest today, Elizabeth Mehren. How are you, Elizabeth?
Hi, I'm good. How are you? What a story. Yeah, what a story.
Have you had such experiences in hospitals?
Oh, yes, many times. And actually, nurses are my heroes. I mean, I learned long ago that if you really want to know what's going on with the patient, don't ask the doctor, because
Right.
he or she will give you some complex answer that makes no sense. And the nurse will tell you in simple English what is happening.
Do you have any stories that come to mind of nurses?
Oh, yes, actually, this is a funny story. Not funny, but my husband and I had a premature daughter, and she was born very, very low birth weight, very early. There was never any medical explanation. And she lived for 3 months in a neonatal intensive care unit. This was in New York. I actually wrote a book called Born Too Soon, which was about what happens to a family when a child comes so early and what happens with all the technology and all that. And the nurse who took care of us, of our daughter and us, was the primary nurse. Her name was Lynn, and she was such an interesting woman. She'd been a teacher. She became a nurse. She was such an interesting woman. But after we lost our daughter, we sort of, the hospital sort of slammed its door on us because we were not a success story. We were the story, the statistic they didn't want. By the way, we didn't want it either, but that was another story. And Lynn and I lost touch. And we'd been in touch once in a while. But don't you know, I got a note from her just a couple of weeks ago saying how excited she was to read this book.
That's lovely.
So we've been in touch together and remembering, the things about our daughter that we had shared very intimately, just the two of us, because we spent so much time together there. Yeah, that was quite that. And then another one, my mother lived to be 95, and she was rather fierce in her old age, which is maybe why she lived to be 95. And she had, through a medical service in California where she lived, she had hospice care, even though she technically didn't have cancer, but she had hospice care. And the nurse liked her so much that A, she kept re-upping the hospice thing, even though she shouldn't have. And B, she scheduled my mother's appointments for Friday afternoons at about 4:00, so she and my mom could sit and drink wine together.
Really?
And she became like another member of our family. And when my mother finally died, I looked around my mom's apartment and I said, Tina, what do you want? And she said, well, she promised me that thing and that. So I just said, take it. It was wonderful to think that some of my mom's stuff would be living with this woman who she loved and who loved her.
Have you seen her since?
Oh, yes, I see her. She lives in San Francisco, and I see her when I'm in San Francisco. She's got 2 terrific daughters that she raised on her own. It's fun. We stay in touch also on email and things.
Elizabeth, aren't you blown away by these strangers whom we meet and they come into our lives for a very short period, but then the affinity, as you said before, the affinity that we create with them runs so deeply?
Yes, I am blown away by it, and I think it's really an important part of life in general. And I think it falls to one party or the other. You don't want to be a pain in the neck. You don't want to keep bothering someone. But I think that those kind of relationships have to be nourished and they have to be cared for. The nurse who was apologizing is going to go home and make dinner and do everything else. But saying thank you to her, if you see her personally, makes a big difference.
Yeah, very much so. I agree with you. And I think that's a great lesson, by the way, through this interview, is for people to be cognizant of those individuals who are doing good things for you and thank them for it, hug them for it, right?
Well, and even not necessarily doing good things for you, but doing good things, period.
Yes.
In other words, sort of cosmically good things. And yes, and acknowledge them. And I think one thing I learned from writing this book is to listen to people, hear their stories, talk to them.
Would you consider yourself a good listener?
I hope so.
Yeah. Would your husband say you're a good listener?
Well, what day of the week you asked him.
Exactly. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we're here today with Elizabeth Mehren. Let me tell you a little bit about her. She's a Portland-based writer, educator, and editor. After working at the Washington Post, she became a national correspondent for the Los Angeles Times and later spent a decade on the faculty at Boston University. Elizabeth earned undergraduate and graduate degrees at UC Berkeley and has written for national magazines, appeared on television and radio, and received awards for teaching and journalism. I Live to Tell the World is her 5th book. As Americans increasingly questions how each of us fits into their or our national cultural tapestry, I Live to Tell the World presents 13 inspiring profiles of refugees who have settled in Oregon. They come from Rwanda, Myanmar, Bosnia, Syria, and other parts of the world. In this book, you find magnificent storytelling about their experiences, and at the same time, you start to understand what genocide is, perhaps why it exists, perhaps why the world is not responding appropriately when genocides happen. It's a heartwarming book, it's a hopeful book, and it's also a scary book to understand what the ability or the capacity of humankind is in the very, very worst of times. So, Elizabeth, firstly, congratulations on writing this book.
Thank you very much.
What was it like when you were doing those interviews? Were you able to sleep at night?
Well, let me step back and say a couple of things. One is, keep in mind I'm a journalist, and I've been covering disasters for many, many years.
Yeah.
And in fact, an old buddy of mine from a different news service and I used to have this fictional T-shirt that said "Disasters are us," because we would only meet each other in the worst moments, when buildings were falling down, or train wrecks, or people stuck in wells, horrible stories. And you it's not that you develop a thick skin, it's not that, but you muscle through it. you get through it. So, but this was a very different process, these interviews, because I did not set out to create a compendium of stories about Holocaust and genocide and atrocities of war. I just started doing some interviews with a nonprofit I work with here in Portland called The Immigrant Story. And I was working, the idea of that this organization was born in 2017 in an attempt to offset the increasingly toxic conversation in the United States about immigrants and immigration. And it was created specifically to sort of normalize the conversation, if possible, by telling stories about immigrants in daily life. And I love doing this because we were working with students from all over these various universities to tell the stories. And that brings out the old Professor Liz in me. I get to be this tough editor and stuff.
Yes.
But then slowly, one of my colleagues said, "Oh, you should be doing this." So the first interview I did in this series, and I didn't know it was a series at the time, was with Eva and Les Egner, who were Nazi Holocaust survivors from Hungary, living not too far from here. My standing joke is I gained like 20 pounds every time I went there because Eva bakes these gorgeous Hungarian pastries. And
yes.
And I had very long, these were all the interviews were based on long, very immersive profiles and interviews, lots and lots of time, hours and hours and hours, and going back for more hours and hours. And something kind of happened, as a journalist, I've always been sort of arm's length and, keeping things away. Somehow these stories crossed into my soul, and I felt compelled to, there was something more personal about them. And I just had to, I had to sort of let go of some of my very rigid separation that I have as a journalist, and tell the stories very intimately, and because people were sharing with me extraordinary things. And I realized that was one of the reasons that one of the things that techniques that's different in here is every single person in this book reviewed the manuscript. And no one, which is, kind of unheard of, we called it collaborative journalism. No one made any substantive changes. No one wanted to. I wanted to make sure that there was agency and authenticity and also consistency, because sometimes when, memories play funny tricks sometimes. So it was what it was like, it was a very, very intense experience to write this book. As I mentioned earlier, I was writing it during the pandemic, and writing a book is always lonely, but during the pandemic, we were all kind of, locked in our little houses anyway. Remember when we thought we could get COVID from doorknobs?
Yeah.
We were all kind of locked inside. And, I found myself thinking, what's a fun thing to do during a pandemic? I know, I'll write about genocide.
Yeah, that's fun.
Yeah, that's fun. And so there I am trying to process these as you said, these very, very complicated, evil, malevolent pieces of history of the last 70 years throughout the world, trying to understand why they happened, why in many cases there was very little global intervention, what happened. So that was, yes, it was very hard.
Let me just take a step back, though. I come from a rabbinical home. My father was a rabbi, hence my mother was a rebbitzin. That's what the wife of a rabbi is called. And we grew up in a home which was active. My father was an activist, so we had many people living in our home, sometimes for a week, sometimes for a month, sometimes for a year. It was hard because there were 5 little bambinos, and my mother did all the work, but my dad brought them home. At the end of all of that, as I grew up, I had been influenced by my surroundings in terms of activism. So later on in my life, I started up an organization, a Jewish humanitarian organization called V'Ahavta. So when people say to me, Avrum, why are you an activist? Why do you care about what's going on in the world? The answer is very obvious. The formula is there. Your father was an agricultural economist, right? Your mom had different jobs. She worked a lot in the house with the kids. But what is it inside your soul, Elizabeth, that would have you write such a book, a very arduous book to write, no doubt?
Well, yes, he was an agricultural economist, but he was also, my parents were in their own quiet way, activists in Berkeley, California, which is kind of redundant if you think about it.
Somewhat, yes.
Somewhat. So, there were various political things. My father worked in every time there were Democrats in Washington, and once when there was a Republican, he had appointed jobs there, and he did things like he helped to create food, the school breakfast program. He helped to create Food for Peace, and a bunch of other stuff, things that were. I mean, I'm not saying he was perfect. There were other things that were not so cool, but he did a lot of social outreach, as did my mom. So we kind of grew up in the sense that you have an obligation to the world around you, and that it's a bigger place than just you, and that while you're important, so is everyone else. And it was also a time, I came of age as we were processing social injustices in the United States and elsewhere. I don't think it's unusual. I don't think it's peculiar. I also think that as a journalist, we often take on the hard stories. So as a working stiff journalist, when I was reporting daily, I sort of had this formula, which was 4 stories for them, meaning the machine that you feed to keep it happy, and then 1 story for me. And the 1 story for me was always about people on the margins. It was always about social injustice. It was about stories that wouldn't be told otherwise, not necessarily famous people, but people who were doing things that merited coverage.
And did that impact upon your motherhood, how you raised your children?
I think so, yeah.
How so?
I think we always have traveled a great deal. We've always traveled a lot because we wanted the world to be bigger than whatever the little small surroundings was that we were in. We've always traveled and seen the world. We've always, when we could, and we've made it possible for kids to travel, to have experiences like that. We, for a long time, I always had when I was teaching at BU especially, I always had brought in, my foreign students would come for either Thanksgiving or Christmas or both at our house. Mm-hmm. We called them our homeless kids because they would come in and celebrate. I remember once a girl from Zimbabwe, in fact, went to hang up her coat we were living in Boston, it's kind of like Toronto, it's very cold. She opens up the coat closet and she goes, oh, so many coats.
Yeah.
And that was true. There were a lot of coats. So I always tried to make our family and our house be inclusive.
So have you been accused of being too generous of spirit?
Never.
Never? Okay.
I don't think that it's possible. I don't think it's possible. I think.
Yeah, no, I happen to agree with you, but I find that people who are not so generous of spirit can find the extension of oneself somewhat annoying. And I was telling that to a person the other day. I think it's just an excuse for not playing a role in making the world a better place,
I'll just feel sorry for them. If they have stingy souls, you just have to feel sorry for them. Because if you don't talk to strangers, everyone's a stranger.
Yes.
If you don't open your heart and your mind to a greater world, you just live inside your own little tiny vacuum.
Do you quite literally speak with strangers?
Oh yes, and one reason. Oh yeah. Well, also we live in a town that's sort of notorious for being. I mean, you can walk. The standing question on Friday is, have you got any fun plans for the weekend? And on Monday, it's did you do anything fun over the weekend?
Yes.
And on Tuesday, it's, how's your Tuesday going today so far? Also, I have a very large dog, and I walk my dog, and I generates conversation everywhere I go. So yes, I know the names of many people's dogs where I don't know the name of the person. But the person and I have just had a 20-minute conversation about something important and something sometimes really cosmic and abstract, while our dogs are sitting there panting. It's kind of wonderful.
What kind of dog do you have?
I have a chocolate lab. He's a rescue dog.
Oh,
He's
beautiful. What color are his eyes?
His eyes are amber.
Oh, beautiful dogs, aren't they?
He's a lovely guy. He was a rescue. He was 2 years old when we got him, and we didn't spend any more money on training him than we did on anybody else's college educations.
Sweet. Beautiful. I find, by the way, the best way to meet strangers, I have an 18-year-old son, and I no longer push him in a stroller. But when I did, it was a great, great way for people to meet me and for me to meet them. And similarly, yes. I had a dog, a German Shepherd, and although he wasn't that friendly, but it was a nice way to meet people as well, So I agree with you.
I have a Labrador Retriever. They just think the whole world is just made to be happy for them. They're just
right. They'll lick you to death, right? They won't bite you.
Well, he'll bite you if he thinks you're a squirrel.
If you're a squirrel.
Yeah, he's working the squirrel eradication project. It's not going well for the squirrels.
I've always been fascinated by storytellers. Part of it has to do with my own heritage. I'm Jewish, and within Judaism, there's a very powerful idea of what's called Masorah. Masorah means to hand down. It's to give over to your children the values and philosophies and the history of our peoples and the history of the world. In fact, there's commandments within our writings to teach our children all the way back 2,000 years ago. So we started schools, at the time of Jesus. And I feel today that storytelling is extraordinarily important. And it is because we need to understand the nature of our parents and our grandparents on how hard they worked very often as immigrants to succeed in the United States, in Canada, many other countries around the world. And you are a storyteller. You're a magnificent storyteller. And I just curious, have you been telling stories your whole life, or do you come from a family of storytellers?
Well, I think so. I think that my career aspiration when I was 8 years old was to be Jane Austen.
Yes.
But I took a little left turn and became, Brenda Starr instead.
Right.
And I think that was one of the reasons that I drifted into journalism, was that it allowed me to tell stories about people. And as I said, to write about the underrepresented and to tell the stories of people who don't get told otherwise. Sometimes very ordinary people living ordinary lives, but guess what? Very few lives are actually ordinary. Most people have a story. And I've kind of enjoyed being the conduit for them. In this case, as I said, initially I didn't know I was setting out to do it, but then it became kind of a mission, and it still is. I felt if we didn't capture these stories, they'd be lost. Mm-hmm. And indeed, we've already lost, unfortunately, Agnon has passed on. He was in his 90s, and he was just a remarkable man. I still see Eva quite a bit. But it was, if you don't gather them, they're gone. And we don't gather stories often about events that we think we know about. So, for example, the 3-year Bosnian War in Sarajevo and Bosnia, I don't think we in the United States knew that much about it. We knew what was going on. Here was this war in the middle of Central Europe, and we didn't really. But I don't think we realized that for 3 years there was no running water, no electricity. There was no glass in their windows. That if you went out to go to the market, you might not come back. That it was just a terrible, that there were bombs and snipers and everything else going on for 3 years. People couldn't go out safely to schools. They couldn't go out to their regular meetings and so forth. They tried to live. I didn't know that. I didn't know how bad it was until I began researching it. And I just feel like, particularly with contemporary history, meaning the history of the last, 40 or 50 years, maybe more, it's really important to record it. And to me, the best voices are those who lived it. The people who've been through it, and they're not experts. They're not military experts. They're not political experts. They're not historians. They are people who lived this experience every day.
And did you find, regardless of where the story was coming from, who it was coming from, a Rwandan, someone from South Sudan, were they open to telling you the story? Were any of them at all like, I'm not comfortable with doing this?
That's a really good question. And the answer was, we made it very clear in the beginning that no one was under any obligation. No one had to do this. And it was quite the contrary. People were dying to tell their stories. Saran Kut, who's a Cambodian genocide survivor, said, I couldn't wait to tell the story. And in fact, the title of this book comes from Emmanuel Torturanye, who is a Rwandan genocide survivor. In the wonderful world of publishing, it took 3 years of getting the thing approved and getting it finished, and finally was finalized, yay! And I get this call from the publisher saying, we love the book, we hate the title. It had a different title at that time. Okay, you try renaming your project after 3 years. It's like sending your kid to preschool and having to give it a new name. So I'm racking my brain, throwing my head against the wall, trying to figure out how to make this work. And I remembered a conversation I'd had with Emmanuel We were sitting on a rock in a park in Beaverton, Oregon. And I asked him why he thought he he and his baby sister, why he had survived this incredible massacre that had killed nearly everyone else in a large and extended family in his village. He's a thoughtful guy. He paused and he said, I think I lived in order to tell the world. So I heard that over and over. I mean, there's 3 Nazi Holocaust survivors' stories in there. They've spoken out, all of them, but all of them did not speak out until the Holocaust deniers showed up. And now they want their stories out there. They're very, very adamant about it. Our Sudanese story, the story about our young man from Sudan, he admits most people can't find Sudan. Same with Myanmar. Most North Americans would be hard pressed to find it on a map. Never mind Rakhine province. So, and what we know about Myanmar is so limited. I mean, we know that because the news is controlled that comes out of there. It's a terrible regime. So we don't have much news from there. So these individuals allowed us to tell the stories from their perspectives of what has been going on and what continues to go on. And no, there was far from resistance. It was, how fast can you write this, Elizabeth? Get it out.
Well done to you for doing so. You know, a number of years ago, I did a gala for my organization with Mia Farrow, and just a beautiful human being, and the things that she does in the world to help others, in particular at that time in Darfur, were just magnificent. And I remember her telling me that she was in the midst of raising money to start a museum in Darfur, which is a bizarre concept there, but not so much here. Why? Because they don't really write down their testimonials as we do. We do it ad nauseum, right? And especially the Jewish people. I mean, if you want to know about the Holocaust, all you need to do is walk 10 feet to the nearby library, and there you go, have a whole shelf of it. But I thought that was really magnificent. One of the things that is very difficult for me in terms of storytelling or writing down people's experiences, and I've done my fair share with Rwandans and people from Sudan and so on. I had a friend of mine who was actually murdered in Sudan, who I did a program with here in Toronto, and she was an activist. You hear stories that I couldn't believe that one human being could do to another. When in your book you write about in Cambodia that Pol Pot, he was an animal of a human being, a terrible person, and he used, in your words, some of the things that Mengele, the Dr. Mengele during the Holocaust, used, experimenting on people who were awake in the most terrible of ways. My first part A of this is, how do you come to grips with humankind having the ability to do this? And B, in your own head, can you get rid of those images?
Answer to B is no. But answer to A is, again, I think it's just that the way you come to grips with it is by telling the stories and by validating them in that sense. Every story in this book, we were really careful about this. Everything was verified and validated. There was no, and that was another reason we actually had on the website of the immigrant story, we have more than 50 survivor stories, and there's only 13 of them in the book. And one reason was we wanted, geographic and geopolitical diversity and gender diversity and age diversity and so forth. But also we wanted to make sure that every detail could be verified. And so therefore there are a few places and a few stories that we had to omit because we simply couldn't do it. I regret that, but we were unable to do it. So to me, it's just so important that you have to overcome your own qualms and your own fears and move forward with it and tell the stories. And remember, I said, I'm a vehicle. I'm the one, they lived the experiences. I have the privilege of telling their stories.
How do you get rid of those images when you need to?
I draw a lot on the lessons that I learned from all of them. And that was something I didn't really see coming. But when I went to, assemble this book, I realized that, and I wrote it in the afterword, that there were consistent qualities that enabled people to survive and make it through these horrible unthinkable, awful experiences. Sveng Ong, who's one of our Cambodian genocide survivors, talked about, waking up next to a dead body when she was trying to escape. It took her 5 years to get out of Cambodia. And similar stories. I mean, we have a very interesting story, I think, out of Vietnam, where on his fourth unsuccessful attempt to escape the communist regime, his father was killed about 20 feet from him. Yes. So here's one thing. It's a sense of perspective. If they can make it through it, well, then I should just shut up and stop complaining. Sveng Ong always talked a lot about that. She said her father always told her that no matter how bad you have it, someone else has it worse. Mm-hmm. And seriously, I mean, and she also said, he said, be a blade of grass, not a tall tree, which means don't put your head up, and you won't be so noticed. And that's what enabled her to survive. But there was also a powerful sense, obviously, in each of these stories is resilience. And, the ability to bounce back after just unthinkable things, horrible things, because you have to move forward and keep going. All right, fortitude, determination, perseverance, sometimes a kind of funny, a little black humor that enables you to get through, that kind of dark humor when things are really bad that you can only laugh because they're so awful. But also, within these stories, there was also a strong sense of faith. And that is not to be confused with religion, because there are many different faiths, many different types of faith represented in this book. But it was the ability to believe in something greater than yourself and to keep moving forward with that. Also, there was the ability to believe in miracles, because sometimes there's no other explanation for what happens to people, just miraculous. So all of those qualities have infused my life, thanks to them, and keeping me, somewhat sane on a good day. But, trying to remember that those, and honestly, again, if you think about, the horrible, terrible things that we all experience on a daily basis, well, they're not really so horrible and terrible compared to those experiences.
Do you believe in miracles?
Absolutely. Absolutely. My family I descend from many generations of Celts, and we believe in all kinds of crazy stuff, we're, yeah, of course. And spirits. And the women in my mother's family were very superstitious. So there are things that we have to sort of honor the superstitions, or they will come and get you.
Have you seen a miracle?
Yes.
Can I ask you what it was?
I don't want to talk about it now, but I have, okay. Yes. And I have. And I've also seen the opposite of miracles. I've seen things that, a miracle basically to me is something where there is no explanation except something happened beyond us.
Outside of nature, you're saying?
Yeah, the first such example. Well, outside of reason and ration too. The first such example was Eva Egner, who is she's one of the Hungarian Holocaust survivors, and she was 7 years old when she and her sister was about 10, and mother were thrown into the notorious, horrible, unthinkably filthy, disgusting Jewish ghetto in Budapest. Her father had been taken and killed. And as the war wore on, and the Hungarians don't like to talk about exactly how evil they were, but they were pretty hell-bent on eliminating everybody too. And it was a terrible regime at that time as well. And so their mother was taken from them and sent. They weren't sure whether it was to be killed or into forced labor. And so the two girls were left alone, and they kept telling people, oh, no, our mother's just around the corner, because they knew if people knew they were orphans, they would be shipped off somewhere themselves. So finally, in the final days of the war, as the war came to a final halt, the Hungarian authorities were determined to get rid of the remaining Jews. So they were marching people to the banks of the Danube River, where they would, of course, remove their shoes and anything else that might be able to be sold, and then shoot them and hurl their bodies into the swirling cold river below. And Eva and her sister were in such a march, and they could see people ahead of them, what was happening to them. And suddenly, out of nowhere, their mother appeared. And she had leapt from a moving train. She had been headed, and she had walked through snow by herself, found her way to where her girls were, and she took her one remaining item of any value, her wedding ring, and bribed the guard, said, "Please, this is all I have. Give me back my girls, and I will give you my ring." And she did, and he did. Now, there's no other explanation for it. How did this woman survive jumping off a moving train, walking through snow, finding her girls just as they were about to be shot?
Yes.
That's a miracle.
Tully Nates, whom I interviewed, she is the founding director of the Holocaust and Genocide Center in South Africa, told me that through her discussions in Rwanda, and she does a lot of work there, trying to bring people, Hutus and Tutsis together, she told me that one of the individuals who was responsible for a genocide of a village was sitting with her. And she turned to him and she said to him very simply, "Why did you do it?" And his response was, "You don't understand. Everybody was doing it. If I didn't do it, they would kill me. That's what it was like. You had no choice." Why did they do it, Elizabeth?
Well, the Rwandan genocide was presented, I think, at the time as something that sort of spontaneously happened. It wasn't. It was very well planned.
Correct.
It was
Yes.
carefully documented. Many international institutions knew it was coming, and
Yes.
so forth, and how they didn't know exactly what day it was going to come. But now in Rwanda, it's illegal to identify people by tribe. There are reconciliation villages. And to go back to Emmanuel Turreturanye, his story is really stunning, and he is a really stunning individual too. He now drives a rapid transit train here in Portland, which is pretty cool because when you see pictures of him, it looks like he's in a jet plane or something. It's really cool. Yeah, he's really super. So, he was a pastor's son. On Easter Sunday, his father had preached the Easter service, and the Hutus and Tutsis were all sitting next to one another praying in an Anglican church. He didn't even know there was a difference between Hutus and Tutsis until he got to elementary school and somebody told him. They all looked alike. They spoke the same language. It made no sense. And he, again, speaking of miracles, it was his turn to cook for the family. He happened to be out with his baby sister cooking in the garden in the backyard when the stuff began, and he picked up his sister and just ran like hell. And he was saved. And what enabled him to live was that a neighbor, a woman they knew very well, took them in. She was Hutu, but she loved them. And so, that goes back to your question about the kindness of strangers and others. But he then had to come to an inner recognition of what had happened. And again, I learned so much from these people. One of the big things that Manuel talks about, he and I just did a presentation at a Lutheran church last Sunday. It was really fun. And anyway, he's very, very deeply Christian and very religious in that sense, and a true Christian, not just a Sunday school Christian. He really is. He practices. He believes in it. And so we talked about the difference in reconciliation and forgiveness, and he really had to reach both of those things in order to survive. He simply could not have gone through what he had gone through, losing so many people in his family and his friends, people he loved, feeling survivor's guilt, feeling anger, feeling all kinds of things if he hadn't been able to achieve those two things. And as he says, forgiveness has to come from within your own soul, from deep within you. The reconciliation involves two or more. When he was married, he fell in love with a beautiful American missionary who was working in Rwanda. And when they were married in Rwanda, people who had murdered his family came to their wedding, and it was, as he said, it was all about reconciliation. He said we had to move forward. We couldn't. And to me, I don't have that strength of character. I would probably have whacked somebody if they'd walked in. But he he believes in it. He believes very strongly that you cannot continue as a human being. Your soul will be broken if you cannot achieve these things.
Nate Leipziger, who's a survivor here in Toronto, he's about 94 years old, and he's the definitive activist having to do with telling the Holocaust story. Nate, and a beautiful human being, Elizabeth. Nate says he has no anger inside of him. He has no anger inside of him. Yet, my sister, whose husband, my brother-in-law, was murdered and left over 6 children. We just went through a parole hearing, and I asked her afterwards, how did you feel about the fellow who killed David? Would you forgive him? She said, absolutely not.
Right. I can understand both points of view. I really can, but it's always impossible to put yourself in those shoes until it actually happens to someone.
Yes, exactly.
And therefore I think it's impossible to be judgmental about either thing. But I will say one thing that was absolutely consistent, and there are three Nazi Holocaust survivors in this book, stories in this book, and actually even many other horrible, terrible genocides. I mean, numerically, of course, Rwanda was only 100 days and 1 million people were killed. Basically, that's how many we know of. Who knows how many were really killed? They weren't very good at keeping records.
No.
So, but there was never any bitterness. There was never any anger. Yeah. The only anger or bitterness I heard was, for example, a couple of my survivors. I get very possessive about them.
I understand. Yes, I get it.
Said, they regretted that the world didn't really understand. For example, there's a really lovely story about a Bosnian musician, and she kept saying it was not a civil war; it was a siege by another country upon Bosnia, and so she objects to the characterization of this as a civil war, and that's. But I think that's different than being angry or bitter. I think that's because she lived through it and she knows. There's a story of an imam from Bosnia, and he has the same view. This was not a civil war. Mm-hmm. This was an assault by an opposing force that blocked off this community. Sarajevo was the longest siege of a capital city in the history of modern warfare.
Yeah, that's right. I want to go back to a question, excuse me, that I asked you a few minutes ago. I'm not quite sure if you answered it or not, and I'd like to hear your answer. There are a number of reasons given by sociologists, in other words, other such studies, as to why genocides are caused. Some of them are ideological beliefs, power and control, scapegoating, social and cultural factors. I'd like to know from you, after your experiences of interacting with individuals who were victims within genocides, what about the flip side? How does humankind have the ability to torture, to maim, to kill, to rape, to do all these terrible things to individuals who were previously their neighbors,
right?
And to sometimes walk away from it and live their lives? How does that happen?
I wish I could tell you that this book enabled me to understand the nature of cruelty and the nature of venality and the famous banality of evil.
Yes.
It enabled me to understand that it continues, that it's been going on since time immemorial, basically, almost, and that it continues. I still marvel that there's not greater intervention from other from other factors and forces that the rest of the world allows this to happen in some ways, and it continues. But the nature of it is exactly what you described: power, ego. If you look at some of the leaders, I mean, you raised Pol Pot as an example. I mean, what a dreadful man he was. He was well educated, and he then he was very well educated. He was educated in Paris, and then he turns around. And what does he do? The first people he kills are the intellectuals. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So he had recruited this large army force because it's better to join them than to be killed by them, I guess, in some cases. I mean, that to me, it mystifies me how quickly again that happened, but it wasn't that quick. It was well planned again. didn't know it was well planned at the time. I really don't understand because I don't understand the impulse that propels people to commit evil events, evil acts upon others. I don't understand it. I mean, I can understand randomness, I mean, a random, I don't like it, but you can understand a random mugging or a random something, or that's different than something that's well orchestrated, well planned, and highly effective from the point of view of the perpetrator.
Mm-hmm. And the flip side of that, the Jewish people celebrate righteous Gentiles. You're familiar with righteous Gentiles? They're good folk. They're very, very generous of spirit folk who saved the lives of Jews or other peoples during Nazi Germany. And in fact, they are celebrated in Israel in big ways. And they're invited to these celebrations of their lives, and they're presented with these awards and so on and so forth. Do you understand the righteous Gentile, the person who saves somebody?
Yes, I do, and partly because Eva Agnon talks a lot about, there were cases of the one righteous man she talks about obviously was the guard who accepted her mother's wedding ring. Now that's not fully righteous. He took a wedding ring, but he let the girls go. He could have accepted the wedding ring and then shot them, all three of them.
Yes.
But then she talks about another righteous man, and that was that just as Hungary had fallen to the communists, and she and her husband were standing in line to get bread, and they heard a conversation behind them where someone said, well, as soon as we get the communists in power, we'll take care of the rest of the Jews. And she turned to her husband and said, we cannot raise a family in this country. We cannot live here. Well, she talks about another righteous man, and that was Dwight David Eisenhower, who allowed 100,000 Hungarians to come into the United States after Budapest fell to the communists. So yes, she talks about that too, and I mean, I don't know if it's a righteous Gentile or a righteous human.
Yeah, fair enough. As a youngster, I had a hard time with the phrase righteous Gentile. Yeah, I get that. When I was putting up some shutters a few years ago, and the fellow who came to put them up was a very, very sweet man, very kind human being. And we started to talk, as I do, with strangers. And he told me that he was from Hanoi. Mm. And as a little boy, he remembers as a little guy the bombing of Hanoi. And he remembers waking up in the morning and seeing piles of bodies in front of his house and how that affected him. And I wrote an article about it for the Canadian Jewish News. And essentially the essence of the article was you never know who's coming to your home to fix your plumbing, to do your carpentry, individuals from Sudan, individuals from Rwanda. And in your book, what I found fascinating is that all of the individuals whom you wrote about, I believe they live in Portland now, right?
Yeah, well, in the metro area, yeah.
In the metro area. And they're doing stunning things with their lives, right?
Well, I mean, there's two things. One is, it's sort of incidental that they all live in Oregon. I mean, This book, I think I could write this book in any state in the United States and probably any province of Canada.
True, yes.
I think going back to what you were saying, I was thinking about the righteous humans, and how Emmanuel and his baby sister managed not to be killed by a woman who by rights should have sent them out. She was a Hutu, and she saved them. She hid them under the bed and told her son, who was in the militia, that if he told anybody they were there, she would kill him. Yes. Her own son. There are stories like that all over. The one, and that goes back again to what we were talking about the kindness of strangers, about people who do something that makes an extraordinary difference in someone's life, and not because they were planning to make a difference in their life, but because that's what they did that moment, and that was their instinct, and that's what did it, and that's what saved them at that moment.
Do you think you would be a righteous Gentile?
Oh God, I hope so.
I hope so. I hope I would too. Yeah.
I mean, but as I said, I would probably take out. I wouldn't even think of myself as a righteous Gentile. I would think of myself as trying to do the right thing by humanity and doing the right. And I think that's to me, I mean, keeping in mind, again, there's so many different faiths represented in this book, and there is so much belief that something is bigger than they are out there, in that sense. But I don't think that it's about any particular sect or any particular way of worshiping or any particular belief system. It's just a greater cosmic thing to me.
Well, what's crazy about this whole area of study and understanding is the byproducts of it, the things that come out of it. One of those things is, and you touched on it before, Elizabeth, is humor.
Yeah.
Now, Viktor Frankl, a psychiatrist and a Holocaust survivor of the Auschwitz concentration camp, is extraordinarily well known for starting a type of therapy which is called logotherapy. He wrote a book called Man's Search for Meaning, and it's one of the biggest selling books in the world. He said to discover that there was an semblance of art in a concentration camp might be a surprise to many. And he said similarly, there was a lot of humor within the camps, and that came out of it. He says humor was another of the soul's weapon in the fight for self-preservation. Did you come across some funny stuff as you were writing your book?
Yes. I mean, some of it, as I said, it's black humor, that it has to be seen in the context. But people who, it's kind of like, that old Dorothy Parker thing, you might as well laugh. Everything's
right.
Yes. And it wasn't that it was hilarious. It was that it was ridiculous in some cases.
Yes.
Sving laughed about the fact that she kept altering her identity persona in order to adapt to whatever the captors wanted. So she could suddenly cut off her very long hair and become perfectly model Cambodian subject. But she wasn't. She was a rebel inside. She wasn't going to do that. She would laugh at herself. There was a lot of the ability to step back. Les and Eva didn't. It wasn't that they never thought it was hilarious, but they never spoke out about this until the deniers showed up. But they could kind of laugh about how terrible things had been, and then they managed to get to come here and make a new life and send 2 kids to the University of Oregon, have grandchildren, make a good life, have careers. There was always a lot of kind of not self-deprecating humor. Actually, Tim Tron, who is a Vietnamese survivor in there, laughs about himself too, that after he and his wife, his wife, they were married at that point, made it through just these on a boat that was grossly overloaded with humans and was attacked by pirates and so forth. He had his glasses taken, his blue jeans taken, everything. When they finally made it to this little tiny island that turned out to be a refugee camp, he laughed because suddenly somebody said, "Is there anyone here who speaks English?" And he raised his hand and said, "Tim Tron, University of California, class of 71." And just, made fun of himself over and over. He went on to become an executive of an international corporation.
Yeah, it's splendid.
And he wanted to tell his story because he felt that it so embodied so many qualities that he was grateful for. But I want to go back to another thing you said. You talked about giving back, which as a big theme in these cultures. And I don't want to perpetuate the kind of grateful immigrant trope, because that's demeaning, I think, to some people. But the truth is that in all of these cases, there is a kind of pay it forward sensibility. And even so, for example, Evelyn Banco and then Eva and Les, the 3 Nazi Holocaust survivors, are part of a speakers bureau, and they are very active in schools all over the region, all over the country, in fact, and they're determined to put this out there. Saran Koot, who I mentioned, he was 9 years old when he came to this country. He was 5 when his father was taken by the Khmer Rouge, and he came to this. The only words of English he knew were the lyrics to Jingle Bells, which he learned in a Thai refugee camp. Keep in mind, Pol Pot was such an evil person. He didn't even know the Cambodian alphabet. He'd never been to school. Mm-hmm. So he, of course, he graduated with a high honors from a public high school here in Portland, got his degree at Portland State University, went to work in management jobs. But what he really wanted to do was give back to the Southeast Asian community here. So he started a restaurant called the Mekong Bistro. It's very cool. And he has a band called the Mekong River Band. It's really cool. It's really fun. My husband and I have been dancing there. We're always about, among the 10% of non-Asians there.
Right.
It's really fun. And every year he holds an event called New Year's in the Park in April, which brings 10,000 people to a public park in Portland to celebrate the Cambodian, Vietnamese, Thai, and I think Hmong New Year's that they all celebrate. So it's a wonderful, wonderful event. And he organized this because he wanted to give back to his community. There's plenty of examples like that over and over. Diana Ihas, who survived, came here from Bosnia, she and her husband, that ex-husband, arrived in Los Angeles. Can you imagine arriving in LA, barely speaking English and not knowing how to drive?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And she ends up figuring out that she was a viola player, and she figured out that if she wanted to do anything in the United States, she better get the education to go with it. So, of course, she has 2 master's degrees and a PhD. And she teaches at a university here in Oregon. But she started something called the Pacific Strings Project, which brings stringed music education to underprivileged kids. Thousands of them all over. I mean, these stories of people replenishing their communities in healthy ways just goes on and on and on. One more thing, you use the word victims, and I don't think these are victims. I think these are survivors. Again, victims, I think the word victim invites a sense of the possibility of self-pity. We never heard a word of that. There was never an ounce of self-pity. There was a pride in survivorship. But never ever, even when a wonderful guy from South Sudan was describing being in these horrible, horrible prison situations with 14 people sleeping in a tiny little shoebox-sized room. They had to sleep head to toe and toe to head. There wasn't self-pity. It was merely descriptive.
Well, I hear you, but there has been a lot of discussion and a lot of research into second-generation survivors from the Holocaust. And when you read the studies, you'll often be privy to such parental mistakes, I would say, amongst some of the survivors, which were when their child was suffering, they would say to them, "What do you have to suffer? Why are you suffering?" That is victimhood. But quite frankly, I get it. And obviously, I'm not going to be critical of anyone who feels like a victim having gone through that.
Right. I think that's diminishing the experience, which is never a valid thing to do. I guess another reason to write this book and to have it out there is to honor the experiences.
Mm-hmm.
And to say that these are important events that these people lived through, and they can teach us through their own experiences about survivorship.
Yeah, granted. Just to pick up on what you were saying before about humor, I was reading up on it a little bit prior to our interview, and there were examples of funnies that came out of the concentration camps. And one of them was a woman went in, and they cut the woman's hair immediately when they went into the camps. And that was a demeaning thing, was an awful thing that they did to them. And all the women were crying, except one woman was laughing. And their friends turned to her. They go, what are you laughing about? What's so funny here? She says, "I've never gotten a haircut for free." It's crazy. Exactly. It's crazy stuff.
Exactly. And that's it. And I think humor enables people to make sense of things that you can't make sense of otherwise. And sometimes if you just realize it's absolutely absurd and ludicrous, and the absurdities are part of it. How else can you explain it?
Oh man, it's nuts. We would be remiss if we didn't talk about the children. And I think one of the things that hit me the most through your book and other research and readings that I've done is how the children were treated in Cambodia.
Mm-hmm.
In effect, they were put into sometimes positions of authority and power over their own parents.
yes, in the case of Saran Koot, he was 5 years old when his father was taken. His father was a teacher and an entertainer, and therefore an arch enemy of Pol Pot and his troops, his murderous troops. So at 5 years old, he became the man of the family.
Mm-hmm.
His mother was then sent off to work in the fields because Pol Pot dreamed of this agrarian utopia. And his grandmother was there, but he was the man of the family. He had to make sure that his little sisters got fed. I think it's another reason he started a restaurant was because he ate dirt half the time.
Yeah.
But also, all of these young people were denied education. They didn't have there was no recreation. There was nothing, there was no acknowledgement of them as humans. They were just little people put into positions of authority.
And also you find in many of these genocides and many wars, children soldiers, right?
Yes, do. And there were a lot of those. Of course, Cambodia was notorious for that, but
Right.
also Sudan and other places. And yes, yeah, really horrible things. And that's basically brainwashing. That's basically, and if you have your choice between being killed and becoming a soldier, well, gee, maybe you'll be a soldier.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, but yes, there's a lot of documentation in Cambodia. It was just rampant and just, horrible.
Elizabeth Mehren, if you had to distill your book down into a line or two about what you would like people to take away from it, what might that be?
Gee, that's tough. Well, I guess one thing I would like the book to convey is that even in the most dire circumstances and these horrible things, there is the possibility of hope. And I feel in our world right now, that's in pretty short supply. So that, and that courage is real, that courage exists, and that there are real people who demonstrate and display courage. That kindness is a virtue, that it always helps if you can be kind to somebody, because you don't know when it's going to pay off, and you don't know when you're going to be the one needing the kindness, maybe. So, and I also think another thing I would like people in this country to recognize the contributions of people who come from elsewhere. That, the United States is, my grandparents were immigrants. The United States is made up of people who came from elsewhere. And right now in this environment, there's been anti-immigrant rhetoric that just makes me cringe, and it makes my stomach hurt, and it makes me just despair of the future when I hear this going on. Because people who are working hard to make us a better culture and to make this a better country, and they're not coming here to exploit and do terrible things. They're coming here to live and have some freedom that we've enjoyed for a long time. So I guess those are big messages, but that's part of it. I would really want no one ever to take for granted the contribution of someone from another country, and maybe stop and talk to that person and find out about his or her life. How did he or she get here? What do they do when they get here? How hard was it? Again, imagine descending on someplace random like Portland, Oregon, speaking no English, and making a life.
Well, why the rhetoric?
Right. Well, that goes back to why genocide. Because I'll tell you why. Because they're easy victims. Because they're easy to pick on. Because othering, as you know, is a very well-documented phenomenon, and that the notion that you can single out a class or group of people as others and pick on them, and they become easy victims. And it's hard to defend them because it may be hard for some people to defend them. It isn't necessarily, because the othering is so powerful.
But why pick on them? Why are they doing that?
I don't know. That's the same. That goes back to why having, because some people need to feel superior to other people. Some people need to have someone to kick down, the human can to kick down the lane. And I don't understand it. To me, it doesn't make sense. It's irrational. But it's right now in the United States, it's just everywhere. And this whole notion of, they're out to get your jobs. Well, for example, my closest friend here is an apple farmer. And trust me, no one else will pick those apples. They've had the same group of people coming from Mexico for the last 35 years, same villages, because people won't do it. It's too hard work. They don't want it, even though they pay very, very well. So I don't understand the need to demean others, but just look at the history of the United States. It's gone on since the beginning. I mean, slavery. It's been going on in this country for the last 300 years.
You know, Jean-Paul Sartre wrote a book called The Jew and the Anti-Semite, and his thesis basically was that it's very easy to feel good about yourself by not doing anything, simply putting down somebody else.
Exactly. But I personally do not understand that impulse. I can understand it objectively and read about it and bless Jean-Paul Sartre's heart for writing it, but I personally don't understand. I find it repugnant.
Have you witnessed the fear of immigrants to the U.S.?
I've heard it. I mean, Emmanuel tells the story about being on a train as a passenger, and some guy gets on the train and starts yelling, "Go back to where you came from." Mm-hmm. We see these incidents going on all over the United States. The immigrant story was born from an incident at Olathe, Kansas, where a guy walked into a restaurant at 5 o'clock, shot up a table full of, turned out to be tech engineers, and calling them effing Arabs. One man died, one man was badly wounded. They were from Pakistan and India.
Mm-hmm. Elizabeth Mehren, I've enjoyed this discussion.
Thank you. I mean, I wish we could be more cheerful, but we can be, because these stories, I think they convey hope. I do. And I feel like we just don't have a lot of that. It's in short supply, or else it's cheapened into something like a greeting card. This is real life. These are people living these stories, and yet they still have hope, and they still have faith in humanity.
So with all of this, do you love life?
Oh yeah, and I absolutely, and I consider life a privilege and a joy, and something not to be taken for granted ever. And I miss some of the people who have gone before me. Of course I do. We all do. But yes, and I mean, I can look out at the leaves changing and feel very lucky to be looking at the leaves changing.
Yes.
I know that sounds corny. I mean,
No, it's gorgeous.
No, but I I love going for a wonderful walk and looking around how beautiful it is, and being grateful for people, for the smile, for a random smile from a stranger.
Well, what do you think your greatest character trait is?
Oh, I don't know. That's a really good question. Honestly, I don't think a lot about my own character traits. I mean, there's a lot I would hope for. I mean, I would hope for kindness. I would hope for compassion. I would hope for caring for others, but I guess I'd also want to have, I don't know, those are pretty important right there. Yeah.
Very good. Well, the reason I say I enjoyed this was a difficult subject matter, one which needs to be discussed. And in that, I commend you for writing your book and other books that you've written, and it's available on Amazon and other outlets, is because of your disposition. Like from the moment I met you, and we've only met a couple of times, I've always found you to be a very, very lovely human being.
Oh, thank you.
I really do.
Thank you. That's really nice of you to say. I mean, I guess it's, there's that whole notion of either having a positive outlook on life or a negative outlook on life. And
yeah.
I think the negative things, I don't want to say whatever doesn't kill you makes you stronger, because I hate that notion too. But I guess, no one's above adversity. Nobody. It happens in everybody's lives, and you just have to move on. And I feel like telling these stories, well, first of all, one thing I'm proud about is there's nothing gory in any of these stories. These stories they're hard to read because of the topic in some ways, but they're not gory. They're not bloody. There's not a lot of, it's not ooh and goo. It's stories about individuals and people, and how they've lived through them. And that was my goal, to have that be. And then, as I said, I also did a lot of, research, so that each story is wrapped in social and political context that gives you some idea of both where the place is and what happened and how.
Yeah, you did a wonderful job, and I thank you for that. And God willing, millions of readers should thank you for that as well.
Thank from your lips to God's ears.
Exactly, exactly. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you once again very much for joining me and for joining us. And very often I like to sort of bring a synopsis at the end of the show as to what I would encourage you to take out of it. The idea behind the show is to give humankind a pat on the back, and it's to do that through inspirational interviews. And I think that what you can take out of this interview with Elizabeth Mehren is gumption, is the ability to hear difficult stories and turn them into something having to do very much about hope. And we do live in a hopeful world. We do. There are problems and we have pockmarks, no questions about it. But there are such beautiful things happening around us and because of us. So find that zone, find that gift that you have to make this world even a more beautiful place. Because I argue, and I think Elizabeth, you'd agree with me, that we all have that within inside of us, right? That gift. Would you agree with me, Elizabeth?
Absolutely. Absolutely. You just have to open your heart and your spirit.
Very much so. Very much so. So until we meet again, thank you. We have some great shows coming up. And I really want to just play my role, just a little tiny role in making the world shine more so like it has the ability to do. So Sei gesund, like they say in Yiddish. Have you ever heard that, Elizabeth? Sei gesund? It means go in good health, basically.
Oh,
Isn't that nice?
yes.
Can I hear you say it? Sei gesund.
Sei gesund.
Oh, look at you. Nice one. Okay. Thanks, folks. We'll be back soon.